Okay, to begin. The 1960s followed on the heels of crisis for Iran. Coordinated increases in oil production compensating for the Suez Canal's 1952 disclosure oversaturated the international oil market, pushing down the price of Persian Gulf crude. Foreign loans that then kept the country afloat after an international blockade on nationalized oil to the mainland Kingdom, almost exhausting the country's foreign exchange reserves, and an attempted coup in 1958 by one of the Shah's own officers, royal government ministries. Yet Stalin, Iran tends to narrate the decade as one of state strength, not state weakness, and for good reason. By the decade's end, Mohammad Reza Shah had transformed from a first among equals to an absolute monarch, disposing of his rival politicians at will, authorizing massive development projects, and redistributing entire villages by decree. One scholar has concluded from these transformations that, quote, the Pahlavi petrostate emerged from the crises of the early 1960s, end quote. But how we are left to wonder, the state crisis begets state building. In this presentation, I will use the categories development to query the relationship between oil and sovereign state power on the one hand, and justice and capitalism on the other. Scholarship on oil, whether it conceives of its power principally in terms of rent or of its materiality, tends to affirm causal connection between oil and anti-democratic state power. But it struggles to explain why a petrostate like Iran put oil revenues, a passive can of profit we are led to believe, to the pursuit of development. Building on the argument that sovereign landlords, quote, and this is David Harvey that I'm quoting, can play an active role in the creation of conditions which permit enhanced future rents to be appropriated, end quote, I first argue that the Pahlavi state treated development as a relationship of appropriation, compensating for the unequal terms of trade sanctioned by the 1954 Iran Consortium Agreement. Pahlavi officials countered the attempts of the consortium to suppress prices, production, and with it, national income, by invoking the nation's need to develop infrastructure and agricultural productivity, prerequisites to industrial takeoff, demanding state intervention and astronomical expenditure, as W. Rostow argued as cornerstone of modernization theory, stages of economic growth. While economic plans are thought to be worth little more than the paper they are written on, comprehensive development plans allowed Iranian officials to argue for increases in both aid and oil production. In the context of post-colonial and semi-colonial countries under the rubric of which we might include Iran, discussions of justice, exploitation, and the aftermath of imperialism are closely tied with the idea of uneven development. The paradigmatic statement today of capitalism's tendency towards unequal distribution. When oil companies united in an effort to push down the price of Persian Gulf crude following the 1958 oil glut, man with fertility will follow, Pahlavi officials arrived at their own estimation of the oil industry's tendency to distribute the risks and rewards of the oil industry unequally. Despite the 1954 agreement's recognition of Iran and the consortium as profit-sharing equals, that same agreement allowed the consortium to externalize profits while forcing Iran to internalize the costs of an energy market vulnerable to price fluctuations, political instability, and other vagaries. Justice, it seemed, operated not as a universal principle, but within and for the perpetuation of a mode of production hostile to Iraq's national interest. The incoherence of equal exchange, when set against the unequal terms of international trade, however, did not prompt Pahlavi officials to abrogate the 1954 agreement, to question the vitality of oil to Iran's economy, or to reconsider the merit of a universal development model. Instead, the Shah, validated by modernization theories, insisted on the need for strong leaders capable of shepherding traditional society to industrial modernity, followed the logic of the agreement to its very end. By disarticulating economic independence, political independence. This disarticulation culminated in the land distributions and social reforms as a white revolution, which promised voting rights, education, and land, in a word, progress, even as the state curtailed their meaningful possibility. But in order to appreciate the characteristic of the international system, Iran sought to send the ring to a few words of Jacques Raverville, most essentially on nationalization. Okay, now we're caught up. On March 14, 1951, the Iranian parliament approved the nationalization law, A single article introduced by Mohammad Mossadegh which read, quote, "For the happiness and prosperity of the Iranian nation and for the purpose of securing world peace, it is hereby resolved that the oil industry throughout all parts of the country, without exception, be nationalized. That is to say, all operations of exploration, extraction, and exploitation shall be carried out by the government." End quote. An international blockade on Iranian oil quickly followed. By 1952, the Iranian oil had plummeted to just 20,000 barrels per day, compared to 664,000 barrels in the 1950s, while total world production had risen from 10.9 million barrels per day in 1950 to 13 million in 1952, an increase more than 3 times Iran's total output in 1950. Revenues had meanwhile fallen from $400 million in 1950 to virtually nothing in 1953. With a total embargo on Iranian oil in effect, the government survived for 3 years on a trickle of exports and foreign aid. The blockade struck home the punishing realities contrary to Mossadegh's belief in the international importance of Iranian oil, so that the West could well do without Iran. It was Iran that could not do without the West. But when Mossadegh went in 1951 in person to the United Nations headquarters in New York to defend nationalization before the international court was dealt with, he made reference to, quote, "the legitimate aspirations of the peoples of India, Pakistan, and Indonesia, and others which fought to obtain the right to enter into the band of nations in conditions that was against complete equality," end quote, and asked that this country begins the right to be persons so that it might realize the political crisis too. Despite a sympathetic UN, protracted negotiations eroded the stability of Mossadegh's government until an American-backed coup removed him from power in 1953 and installed General Zahedi in his place as prime minister. The 1954 Iran Consortium Agreement, negotiated between the Zahedi government and the newly established consortium, popularly known as the Allied Seven Sisters, reintroduced Iranian oils to the international market. This time under a 50-50 profit-sharing arrangement already operating in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Venezuela, Iraq, and elsewhere. The agreement, which promised equality of profits and recognized Iran's ownership of oil deposits and refineries in the agreement area, extinguished any possible accusation that the foreign managers and native owners of Iranian oil existed in unequal relation, and, moreover, brought Iran up to date with the profit-sharing principle that prevailed in all the rest of the Middle East, crucially without exceeding it. Yet in reality, the agreement isolated the state through its agent, the National Iranian Oil Company, NIOC, from all operational matters, most significantly production and pricing, and gave the consortium for the next 25 years influence over the amount of petroleum pumped and the price it was marketed for. Like earlier proponents of nationalization, Iranian signatories to the agreement assented to the economic primacy of oil. Unlike their predecessor, however, who saw this question of political sovereignty as inextricably tied to resource sovereignty, as Mohammad Mossadegh, for instance, articulated before the UN, signatories to the agreement naturalized the system of foreign oversight and national ownership that paved the way for top-down oil-fueled development. While the 1954 agreement increased the amounts of oil revenues at the Iranian government's disposal, the state had already tied oil to development through the Plan Organization, or Sazman Barname, a semi-autonomous state institution formed in 1949 and a recipient of the Eisenhower administration's economic aid strategy. By law, the Plan Organization was to receive no less than 60% of all oil revenues. At its helm was Abu Hassan Eftihad's pictured here, a technocrat firm in two convictions. One, that politics could and would be divorced from planning, and two, that Iranians, not yet ready to stand as partners in development, were best treated as beneficiaries. In addition to its share of oil revenues, which averaged closer to something like 75 to 80%, the PO received funds sometimes constituting 20 to 30% of its overall budget from the U.S. government and non-governmental organizations like the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the Forest Foundation, all contingent on approval of Iraq's development plans. Only 2 years after its founding, the Plan Organization came to a standstill when the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company blocked newly nationalized oil, branding it stolen, from leaving the country. This rendered the first development plan a dead letter. As Pahlavi Zahedi, an economist with the Planning Organization, explained in 1973, quote, the implementation of the first plan never really got underway. The first 2 years of the plan were mainly devoted to the setting up of the plan organization and related administrative matters. Meanwhile, with the nationalization of the oil industry in 1951 and the ensuing crisis, the plan organization lost its main source of finance as foreign exchange. Subsequently, for a period of more than 3 years during the oil crisis, little could be done to execute the plan. Indeed, for all practical purposes, the first plan proved to be abortive. End quote. With the resumption of oil activity in 1954, the government quickly set to work drafting a new development plan, one that would be in line with the increase in oil revenues anticipated. The second plan, effective for the 7 years between 1955 and September 1962, was finalized in less than 9 months. The objectives outlined in the plan included, quote, increasing production, developing exports, preparing public necessities within the country, developing agriculture and industries, discovering and exploring mines and subterranean resources, improving and completing means of communication, improving public health, fulfilling certain operations designed for the development of the country, raising the education of living standards of people, and inclusive living conditions. End quote. In terms of sectoral allocation, the second plan prioritized infrastructure, agriculture, and industry in that order, viewing close to prevailing thinking about the necessary stages of development. Budgeted at $930 million and later raised to $1.1 billion, the second plan was much greater than the aborted first. And crucial to this were oil revenues, which within the world of development distinguished Iran as something of special taste. Iran had a point important exchange reserves, that is, at least until 1958. What it was thought to lack was foreign know-how. Convinced that Iran's government ministries were, quote, not equipped to assume quickly and with precision and competence the duties of development system that's of Eftihad, especially one of the magnitudes the expected oil revenues to permit, Eftihad, an investor suggestive of some historians' claim that the U.S. stood in relation to Iran in the 1950s as a, quote, empire by invitation, end quote, asked the Ford Foundation in 1954 for assistance in identifying American economic advisors who might staff a newly formed economic bureau. To the final negation. The Ford Foundation turned to Edward Mason, a founder of the School of Industrial Organization, an early exponent of modernization theory, and at the time a dean at Harvard University. After a few exploratory missions, the Ford Foundation granted the Planning Organization $1.2 million to support the creation of what would be known as the Harvard Advisory Group in 1967. Mason recommended Kenneth Hansen, history theory, and his papers are held by the Hoover Archive, as a field administrator to the group, and the American educated economist Bita Mousavi as director of the Economic Bureau. Their salary, alongside those of other staff members, the Hague, and the Economic Bureau, would be supplemented by the SAM. Thus, as the historian Gregory Hewitt has written, quote, the Ford Foundation found itself not only funding a foreign mission to Iran, but a division of the Planning Organization itself, end quote. While formerly the Hague had been planned to prepare a sound economic development program of the magnitude possible with oil revenues, quote, to train Iranians for positions on the Bureau and advise on operations, end quote, the impending 1958 financial crisis demonstrated the extent to which this partnership favored American conditionality. Relative to the 60% of oil states Iran had received under the 1901 Darcy concession, under the 1954 agreement's 50-50 principle, Iran's revenues from oil jumped from $90 million in 1955 to $285 million in 1960. Although much of this derived from an increase in production as well. But the Hague had barely set to work recommending best uses of this revenue when in August 1958, Salman Farmayan and Hansen estimated that the plan organization had exceeded its original budget, and the state spending received revenues by $933 million by September 1962. Iran had been used to trade imbalances, but before 1958, capital from consortium royalties, World Bank loans, and U.S. government aid, for instance through the Point 4 program, had helped manage them. By 1958, however, loans that had stabilized the country after nationalization demanded repayment. causing expenditures to mount so severely that Fahdman and Hansen redoubled their warnings, this time suggesting that the state would deplete its foreign exchange reserves as soon as 1959 if it did not correct its budget and trade deficits. When the consortium announced a price cut for most Persian Gulf crude in February 1959, isolating producer states like Iraq that insisted on better terms, Iran was left $26.5 million short of the revenue it had anticipated, just as the Shah was negotiating a defense treaty with the U.S. According to one 1960 IMF report, the increase in Iran's foreign exchange receipts from the oil sector was less in 1959 than in the previous year, despite a 12% increase in petroleum output and trade. Impatient with the Plan Organization's management of the crisis, who lost confidence in the organization, already viewed by other ministers as foreign influence, and in Etihad in particular, began to erode. The Shah thus moved to introduce legislation that would transfer the power and the responsibility of the head of the Plan Organization directly to the Prime Minister. In response to this, Etihad tendered his resignation. Although the Shah refused to accept Etihad's departure from the Plan Organization, he removed him from his post days later in February 1959. With oversight transferred to government ministries hostile to central planning, the Plan Organization and the Hague in particular came under intense scrutiny, while the Economic Bureau was reduced, quote, preparing applications for more broad loans. Meanwhile, by 1960, Iran had entered into a full balance of payments and inflation crisis. The Shah's ministers advised the governments to seek an immediate emergency funding package from the IMF amidst mounting discontent. Teachers and students protested lowest wages, and the National Front demanded new elections. After considering waiting till Iran reached a, quote, absolute crisis point, end quote, the IMF agreed to provide $35 million in standby credits, and the U.S. government offers loans to further cover the funding gap. The IMF stabilization package was contingent on the implementation of budget cuts, spending suspensions, administrative reforms, greater budgetary oversight, and the formation of a central bank, Bank Markazi, to regulate the currency. While the package helped Iran avoid a foreign exchange crisis, the economy nonetheless fell for recession in the second half of 1960, moving the Shah, after resurgent protests, to remove the city prime minister, Sharif Imami, after a short tenure of 6 months, and appoint the report of Ali Abini in its place. While the new director of the Plan Organization, Ahmed Aramesh, blamed the second plan's shortcomings on the, quote, extravagance and indecision, end quote, of the organization's foreign educated staff, Hague officials diagnosed its failures, as a problem planning. Both Hansen and Fahdman criticized the lack of coordinated planning efforts, the state's inflationary spending, and more privately, the Shah's profligate military purchases, which diverted needed money away from development. A 1960 report by the Economic Bureau's director, Fahdman, for instance, concluded, quote, these general aims of the second plan found expression in broad programs for most sectors, but little or no attempt was made to make these programs consistent with one another. Furthermore, the objectives were not translated into a consistent set of clearly stated quantitative targets. The plan, therefore, was primarily obtained for apportioning financial resources among the various sectors of the government's own direct programs, end quote. Backward Dastari, an economist with the Plan Organization, similarly concluded, quote, the second plan was simply a list of investment programs and projects, the selection of which did not follow through the application of any specific investment criteria, including any type of cost-benefit analysis. The only mandate of consistency and balance observed in designing the file of the project was the sum of financial outlays on the project did not exceed the total financial resources available to the Plan Organization. However, even this was never adequately satisfied. Economists and planners lead from the experience of the second plan in the 1958 balance of payment crisis, the need to prioritize in the third plan low-cost but large-scale efforts like seed banks and improved fertilization over costly irrigation projects like the Cadillacs Dam in Tehran or the Zahedi Family in Fellowship. Building on these absurd discrepancies between estimated and actual expenditures, later scholars like Hamal Patizian offered harsher indictments. The Pahlavi state, in Kutuzyan's view, had not just misapportioned but squandered hundreds of millions of dollars, in both oil revenues and aid. Katusian explained, quote, assuming that the official figure of 87,200 million reals, or $1,147 million of actual expenditures for the second plan is correct, the total actual plan expenditures were less than the amount of foreign aid alone, as if there had been no revenues from oil use at all. Yet by 1960, hardly anything permanent and useful had been achieved, and the country was bankrupt, end quote. While I do not doubt the corruption bogging down Pahlavi politics, I think it is worth touching on why the second plan took the plan of shocking list of investment and why government expenditures remained untapped. Rather than presume the inefficiencies, indulgences, and vanities variously ascribed to the Shah, the plan organization, and other governing methods, I suggest that the transformation of the plan's organization during the 1958-60 crisis into an appropriate of institutions, one, restricted both foreign oversight of development without reducing foreign funding for it, and two, counteracts the philosophy of national income after the 1958 price cuts. Thus, if institutions like the IMF and Ford Pat David sought to discipline the state against inflationary spending, they failed in the long run to reorient the state, even as they succeeded in the short term at tightening credit and cutting government expenditures. The Ford Foundation recognized this much. While it extended funding to HAG to aid in its completion of a draft of the third development plan, once the second 7-year plan came to an end in 1962, the foundation withdrew entirely from Iran. In a summary delivered in December of that year, officials wrote, quote, the Economic Bureau of the Plan Organization after 5 years, $1.5 million, is a hollow shell. An effective institution has not developed. Its potential leaders are scattered. End quote. With the autonomy of the increasingly unpopular plan organization Chads, the third plan can now be presented as proof in foreign loan application as evidence of the Shah's commitment to a sound approach to economic development, leaving him free, meanwhile, to embark on his revolution of the Shah and his people, otherwise known as the White Revolution. The Shah's White Revolution brought in former Prime Minister Amini's program of family plans. They include women's suffrage, the privatization of state-owned factories, rural literacy, and benefits for industrial workers. Historians of Iran, however, have understood motivations for the White Revolution to lay not in the Shah's interest in reform, but in instantiating a myth, a politics of promise, and a performance of revolutionary kingship. As one scholar has written, quote, the goal of the White Revolution was a demonstration of the Shah's reform or desire for reform to silence critics in Iran and abroad. Politically, the White Revolution was effective. And I think this cartoon demonstrates the kind of conventional view that the reforms are not motivated by real sincerity. It says, so, according to the belief of Muhammad, the only revolution was letting in history was the White Revolution. And here you see a Sarawak Aiken strangling the people, and himself probably trying to seek their mouth. Okay, so if the White Revolution convinced some of the Shah's commitment to reform, it worried others. The Ford Foundation, for instance, questioned whether social stability and agricultural productivity would really ensue from a piecemeal program of land reform, while others, like Hansen, privately commented that it solved the promise of parliamentary governance. In short, the White Revolution, despite the widely held view of the Pahlavi government as applying states to the U.S., did not in fact elicit the universal support of its allies. So if we cannot explain the White Revolution in terms of Cold War pressures, how might we understand the emergence of land reform as a central nexus of political action, especially since the principal economic link between Iran and the world economy was not agriculture, but oil? Some, like the political scientist Eric Hoogland, have argued that land reform functioned to break up the political power of Iran's landlords, and to furnish the state with the social support and foreign approval needed to ensure its survival. To this, other scholars, like Afsan and Najmabadi, have responded that, quote, without an analysis of the Iranian state, it cannot be clear why a conflict between the central government and the landlords existed to begin with, end quote. And so, rather than grasp the motivation for land reform, In primarily political terms, Mousavi situates Iran in a world economy to argue that, quote, the changing structure of the post-World War II international economic order made an accelerated expansion of internal markets and commodity production in these countries not only possible, but positively desirable, end quote. Land reform and agricultural industrialization were to free up, according to this view, labor for the industrial sector, expand monetary relations, and provide a market for the products of growing Western manufacturing industries. Yet, endowing capital with the ability to dissolve railroad relations and erect in their place forms of labor and exchange conducive to its expansion diminishes the dynamism of the very forces Mousavi attributes so much explanatory power to. I think that if we instead analyze the white revolution not as a bolt from the blue, but as a parallel process to the transformation of development into a relationship of appropriation, a more complicated picture emerges. One that appreciates the ways in which the unequal terms of trade and the suspicion surrounding the clan organization coalesce to influence the Shah's pivot to land reform, first as a project of land redistribution and later as one of principally agricultural industrialization. While the White Revolution did thus orient agriculture towards capital-intensive methods of production, which because of their costliness displaced many farm-working families from their lands, this was not an intentional act of proletarianization, but rather a continuation of the Shah's attempt to renegotiate through development its terms of engagement with an oil industry predicated on and made profitable through unequal terms of trade. Using the argument made by OPEC General Secretary and former advisor to the Shah, Fuad Rouhani, that, quote, cutting oil prices at a time when industrial goods and imports were becoming more expensive and was tantamount to economic warfare and a return of coercive imperialism, end quote, Iranian diplomats and delegates of NIOC asserted sovereign rights not only to the nation's oil wealth, but to produce it at quantities conducive to national development, regardless of the consortium's obligation to other producer states. Their arguments had real, if unintentional, theoretical purpose and a fundamental contradiction of capital. Iran and consortium stood as juridical equals, yet their partnership produced unequal exchange. The oil industry, as operated by the consortium, held out the promise of development only to forestall it, and this could only be corrected if the production process was made to accommodate the needs of national development. When the consortium refused to commit to increased production limits and export capacities for Iran beyond the coming year, delegates of the NIOC argued at the end of the third plan in May 1967, quote, the consortium's proposed production and export capacities have no meaning for us. Because the government needs a reasonable estimate of the amount of oil revenues in order to set its development plans, we need to determine export figures. Assuming that even capacity proposed in the above plan is exceeded, this would still not meet the expectations of the Iranian government and cannot be accepted by the National Iranian Oil Company. The government of Iran will need about 12 billion riyals of investment to implement the country's fourth development plan in the next 5-year period, of which about 5.9 billion riyals should be invested from the oil export area in the consortium. Therefore, it is necessary for the member companies of the consortium to adjust their export plans in such a way that the desired amount will be earned by the Iranian government within the next 5 years. End quote. Development thus not only functioned as a demonstration of the Shah's capacity for reform, as some have argued, but as an international injunction for financial support. By linking national development to the political economy of oil, petrostates, as the scholar Giuliano Garibini has argued, quote, embodied and spearheaded the international struggle for sovereignty over natural resources. They came to represent and symbolize one of the key development strategies of post-colonial government, end quote. But if their argument for resource sovereignty had theoretical purpose to understanding how juridical equality concealed economic inequality, it had real limitations too. To begin with, the justifications delegates provided appealed to rather than questioned the mutual benefits of increased oil production, the geopolitical anxieties of the moment, and Iran's pride of place in mitigating regional restiveness. Citing, as NIOC delegates did, for example, the, quote, responsibility of Iran in maintaining and guarding the security of the Persian Gulf, the historic support and assistance Iran provided the West to meet its oil needs during the recent crisis in the Middle East, and the prohibition of oil exports introduced by oil-rich Arab countries, the bitter experience that oil companies learned in the past from the uncertain and untrustworthy behavior and action of oil-rich Arab countries, and finally, the likelihood that the excess income of Arab countries will, quote, reach the hands of the aggressors in this region and will be spent on creating chaos and insecurity, which will financially hurt Western countries and oil companies, end quote. In other words, Iran questioned the basis upon which the consortium apportioned shares of a growing pie, but using the very language of stability, support, and security that had before justified its isolation of producer states like Iran. Yet, to the long list of justification Iranian delegates brought for them, consortium representatives simply responded that, quote, due to the investment and commitments they have made to other producing countries in the Middle East, and due to the restriction that from the political, economic, geographic points of view and the situation of their markets, they cannot accept additional and new obligations to Iran, end quote. To which they added that even if they were able to increase Iran's oil exports, quote, adopting this procedure would cause severe concern, dissatisfaction, and disruption in Western countries, which will not only harm the oil companies, but would also not be useful for the Iranian government, end quote. The consortium, in other words, was a better assessor of mutual benefit than Iran could ever be. Iranian officials, however, continued to push the juridical concepts of right, equality, and obligation, insisting that Iran was not asking for foreign assistance or a handout, but fairness in its dealings with the consortium. In a set of 1967 talks with the UK Foreign Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Gordon W. Roberts, Mohammad Reza Shah explained that as Britain planned its withdrawal from the Persian Gulf, Iran had no interest in acquiring territory as a means of preserving regional stability, since its economy was a much greater assurer of this. But crucially, he explained, Iran needed oil production and export capacities increased. Mohammad Reza Shah explained, quote, we know that there is a sales market, yet our oil is not sold. I hope you know how we spend our money. We do not put it in British banks as Kuwait does. There is no doubt that if we had more money, you would have been able to sell Iran more materials. And I am happy that a number of British companies are coming to invest in Iran. But in any case, we need more money to implement our construction plans. And the oil companies must compensate a deficit of income by extracting more. We are ready to tell our oil friends that we desperately need this money. This is the important issue, which we need a lot of, end quote. By arguing for a need to increase oil production with reference to the monetary demands and mutual benefits with development, Iranian oil elites grappled with, even if they did not fully reconcile, contradictions endemic to capitalism. Its notion of equality of exchange on the one hand and the inequality of positions from which parties like Iran and the consortium exchanged on the other. But rather than question the principles on which exchange happened altogether, at least for the time being, Pahlavi officials remained firm in their conviction that the oil economy was growing and large enough to allocate to each producer state production limits conducive to its national needs. In a series of later 1971 negotiations between Foreign Minister Ardeshir Zahedi and Roberts, the UK Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, for instance, Zahedi explained that the oil companies should increase Iranian production limits, not at the expense of other oil producers, but relative to Iran's fair share of the market. Zahedi stated, quote, what we Iranians are saying is opposed to what the oil companies are saying. We have never said that the oil companies should stop their extraction in Arab countries. What we are saying is that fair share should be given to Iran. For our next 5-year plan, we need an amount exceeding 6 billion riyals, of which 5 billion and 900 million must come to us from the consortium so that we can develop our heavy and light industries. The future of our relations depends on this plan. I advise you to understand our situation. We do not want extra money to buy Cadillacs or build castles. We want to develop people's living standards. I know your answer to my statements is that the oil companies are not subordinate to the British government, and that they do not listen to you, but we expect your cooperation. We are not saying that the oil companies should forget their situation in other oil countries, but we are saying that they must increase our share, end quote. To this, Roberts, apparently forgetting that until 1951, the Iranian government had dealt with a company in which the majority shareholder was the British government itself, responded exactly as Zahedi predicted. Quote, "We cannot interfere in the work of the oil companies. This matter is related to the oil companies and the government of Iran, and our role is very limited. As a minister, I must tell you that we in England have the experience that any increase in oil extraction must depend on the market. You stated that you want to implement your plans by selling oil. In reality, you are asking for a share greater than additional oil production." End quote. The organization of the oil industry into a consortium of private companies thus allowed, as I think the previous vignette demonstrates, consortium members as well as their respective governments to deflect in their dealings with producers. This lesson was not lost on development officials either. In 1961, Ebtehaj, who had already been removed from the plan organization in 1959, and so maybe had nothing to lose, delivered a speech to the International Industrial Conference explaining that $1 billion in American foreign aid had only caused Iran to revile the country more than ever before. Bilateral aid, Ebtehaj explained, quote, "poisons the relationship between nations, frustrates the donor, and causes revulsion in the recipient," end quote. In such circumstances, no one is safe from suspicion and recrimination. Quote, "Opposition leaders will charge the government with selling out to imperialists, and the public will believe those charges. Civil servants will find their own relatives accusing them of having been bought by foreigners," end quote. What is needed, he explained, was to eradicate suspicions of imperialism altogether through an international agency capable of administering aid and imposing rules and financial regulations. Upon his return to Iran after delivering this speech, Ebtehaj, as he and many others suspected, was arrested. While Ebtehaj's arrest might come as no surprise, what is striking is the similarity his suggestions bore to those Kenneth Hansen, the former field director of the Hague, offered privately to U.S. officials in 1962. Hansen suggested that the third plan, which the Hague, as part of its final push in Iran, was helping draft, take a, quote, "consortium approach" to its financing and administration, quote, "including as a minimum the U.S., IBRD, the IMF, the UK, and Germany as parties to it," end quote. This approach would benefit the U.S., Hansen maintained, since, quote, "the U.S. will have an opportunity to study and comment on the entire planning approach. It will be possible to pinpoint the key areas of reform, reorganization, or program emphasis, and to insist upon immediate tangible steps to set these in motion as prerequisite measures, and to establish clear criteria and conditions for U.S. participation, while at the same time not burdening the U.S.-Iran bilateral relationship with either the entire responsibility for assistance or the sole onus of policing the conduct of the Iranian government," end quote. By the time Ebtehaj and Hansen made their proposals for organizing development along lines reminiscent of the oil industry, the Shah had already vacated the planned organization of autonomy and foreign authority. But it was in a sense too late for the Shah too. His reputation as a puppet of the U.S. attached to him from his early stage in power had crystallized. And so when in March 1967, Hansen argued for revitalizing America's flagging commitment to foreign aid at a Stanford University symposium on development, international law, and economics, he was right to concede that the United States faced a, quote, "credibility gap" in seeking support for foreign assistance, end quote. Invocations of security or some timely aspect of national self-interest, he asserted, no longer sufficed. Quote, "We certainly cannot, with credibility, see Soviet communists, Maoists, and anti-Americanists under every bed, and profess to use the broom of foreign aid to sweep them out. We cannot, with credibility, picture a world of teeming billions, at first clamoring for and then seizing in desperation their share of resources, as has been argued by neo-Malthusians," end quote. What was needed, Hansen concluded, was to simply argue for foreign aid on the basis of shared humanity. Yet Iran's encounter with the oil industry, as I have tried to demonstrate, vulnerable as it was to instabilities that the consortium could easily internalize onto Iran, made it difficult to believe that these interests, corporate, national, and international, could ever be rendered commensurate. Pahlavi oil officials nonetheless played on the language of security, stability, and economic growth to make impassioned pleas for increasing Iranian oil production.
using the idiom of development, but against this growing backdrop of suspicion and uncertainty. So this story is not one of the triumphs of resource nationalism, I think. While development allowed Iranian officials to insist on increases in oil production and foreign funds for long-term national development, their efforts fell short of reworking the terms of trade and of freeing Iran from foreign conditionality. Rather, with every advance in profit sharing and with every extension of foreign aid came an intensification of Iran's obligations to foreign powers. In the case of the Des Dam project, a regional development initiative in Khuzestan central to the second plan, the IBRD, and I'm using this as an example, stipulated in its loan agreement that the borrower, i.e. Iran, shall make arrangements satisfactory to the bank for setting aside part or all of the oil revenues as received or credited to or for the benefit of the borrower or the plan organization or otherwise for the payment of the principal of and interest and other charges on the loans and the bonds. With this condition, the IBRD prevented the Iranian government from collateralizing against its oil revenues outside the Western Bloc, meaning oil revenues would be funneled back into the dollar system and the Bretton Woods institutions used to coordinate controls over oil pricing. Thus, even as Iranian officials pushed to expand the market share and production limits available to Iran, revenues remained entangled in a web of conditions and stipulations not of the country's making. In short, and in conclusion, it goes without saying, in the words of one 1960 publication, that, quote, oil and money from its sale are basic to the development of Iran, end quote. Oil's seemingly magical properties, not least of which include its alchemical power to transform into money, have been well studied by scholars of other petrostates, like Nigeria, Venezuela, and Saudi Arabia, as have the ways in which these states harness oil revenues for economic planning and national development, hoping to catapult themselves into the first ranks of industrial modernity. The Pahlavi state, like its peers, zealously invested in Iran's infrastructure. But the proliferation of market relations and heightened agricultural productivity did not materialize. Contemporary diagnoses varied from authoritarianism to poor planning, as we have seen. But I have tried to suggest that the oil industry established, especially after 1954, a dialectic of juridical equality and economic inequality that Iranian officials contested through development, but ultimately entrenched. The fact that third world countries like Iran ultimately defended a trade regime that precluded their international ambitions can be explained in light of this tension. While inequality and injustice are often theorized in terms of the relationship between labor and capital, focalizing oil as a form of energy and as a mode of extraction helps us understand how capitalism operated in and against nature exporting societies, like Iran. The problems Iran today forces onto the table of resource exhaustion, authoritarian development, and ecological collapse are relevant wherever human life has come to be organized around the principles of limitless growth and consumption. But the history of these processes is not undifferentiated either, and attending to their specificities helps us account for the role of resource-rich but peripheral countries in the formation and reproduction of global capitalism. The Pahlavi state, which harnessed development to renegotiate the term and volume of the West's engagement with Iranian oil, but not without, as we have seen, deepening Iran's dependence on Western funds in the oil industry, thus offers a cautionary tale on the logic of endless growth, which organizes life today everywhere from Abu Dhabi to Arizona, from Stanford to Shiraz. Thank you.
Yeah, it seems to me that 50-50 split. It's more like 50-50 split from revenue rather than profit. Because the consortium actually puts a limit on the amount of production. So it seems to me that 50-50 get 50-50 of revenue rather than profit. Am I right?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure myself if there is a technical distinction that we could be making between revenues and profits. I may have been using them interchangeably in.
But profit means that revenue less the expenses, including development and of oil and all the expenses related to that.
I mean, I think that.
It makes a big difference.
I think that's true. I think what I've kind of understood from reading into negotiations and discussions contemporary to this period is that the way Iran is thinking about revenue, it also takes into account the fact that the revenue that the consortium members takes almost sometimes like exponentially increases once it's imported into different countries through taxation. So in their views, there's like a double process of profit making that the consortium members benefit from, whereas Iran, as maybe you're suggesting, has to subtract from the cost of the revenue that it receives, the use of machinery and so on, that actually after the 1954 agreement, it is kind of conceded ownership of. So I think you're right that it's definitely, it's more complicated than 50-50 suggests, but that's part of, I think, the point I was trying to make too, is that the 50-50 principle kind of creates this really like transparent, convincing image of equality, concealed behind which is this much more kind of complicated and fraught reality, both kind of operational, financial, and so on. Thank you.
That crisis of 1958, 1960, it seems like there were three elements involved there. This was one about Iran.
Right.
So, then it was Shahs standing on aircraft or whatever. And then there were some social programs obviously there by the government. So it was not clear by your presentation to me that which one was really the main culprit. Probably Salman about that, I can think, but look at the others as well.
I think it's really a combination of some of the different factors you're alluding to, and I think that is kind of what was to me so striking and interesting about this period, which as far as I know, I don't think there's many like studies that dedicate themselves to an exploration of this period in particular, but I think you're right that it witnesses a confluence of so many different events, right? The Sazman Barnameh, or the Plan Organization, quickly, sort of outspends the budget allocated to it. But it's at the same time that, I think you're gesturing to, there's a defense treaty that's being negotiated that Iran's already like very firmly committed to and that Mohammad Reza Shah refuses to back out of. And you have to take into account the fact that the government is now being asked to repay the loans that were extended to it to help stabilize it after nationalization, right? So it's the fact that all of these three things, maybe more, come together in such a short time period that I think allows the government to kind of rethink and reorient its relationship both to the consortium and to prevailing conceptions and practices of development. Yes, Professor Milani?
58 period, what you're referring to, for example, the Shah makes a very serious effort to sign a long-term agreement with the Soviet Union and doesn't tell Western allies till the last minute. So the narrative you have makes the Shah very passive in all of this. 5 years later, he actually signs a long-term agreement for oil and gas with the Soviet Union. So the notion that he is only marching to what the IMF tells him, what the Americans tell him, I think misses much of the complexity, particularly in this 1559, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's important that this is the 1960 loan that, for instance, Iran signs with the IBRD does take place at the height of what's called the Soviet oil offensive, right? But I think I gestured towards that loan to show that, in the long run, although Iran does flirt, Mohammad Reza Shah does flirt with the possibility of engaging with the Soviet Union. It, at the same time, as it considers this as an alternative possibility, does things like commits to loans that will counteract the very possibility of more meaningful engagement with the Soviet Union by, for instance, making it so that Iran's oil revenues have to be set aside to service its financial obligations to, Western and international organizations like the IBRD. So I think, yes, I don't mean to suggest that the Shah assumes an entirely passive attitude towards this. And in fact, I think I tried to highlight some of the passages where he and other officials are really kind of staunchly insisting on more production, exactly to counteract that narrative. But I think, it's kind of interesting to me to question why that sticks so tight, or it sticks so firmly to him, right? And I think that has to do in part with the ways in which the plan organization, development, and so on come to be associated as really just kind of like Trojan horses for imperialism, right? For reasons that are and are not totally unfounded, I would say. Hi.
You know the caricature that you showed
Yes.
about that one. I got a kind of feeling of rejection because as I remember the White Revolution, no matter what you call it, revolution or reform, but it was a really big improvement in society because I remember before that the women could not leave their family home until that they get married. And by having a sepahe-daner, sepahe-behdash, for the first time the villager that have never seen women in power have seen that young women came in power and would bring the many services, but also representing the government with the uniform. It means power. And at the same time, the family in the cities, they learned that their daughter can go alone and live in another place that was unusual before that. It was really big revolution in the mind, in the society, in the structure of the old, 1,000 years old thing that I feel that it was really revolution and many things was very unfair to Shah. Because for instance, this suburb, I have friends that they have been in prison Shah time and now, and they told me that now is 100 times worse than Shah time. And even the suburb treatment, and I feel that when I see that caricature, I'm just like feeling, oh, no, it's not fair. I wanted just to say that I feel that really we did a revolution, at least for women, in 1960s, by bringing women to the villages, separating them from the family.
I think you're absolutely right that this is also a period not just of a conjunctural financial crisis, but immense social transformation. And I would hope at a later point to be able to kind of treat those aspects more seriously in my dissertation research. But I think my focus was more or less intentionally limited to kind of thinking through how the white revolution even emerges as a possibility. Because I do think you're right that it was regarded as pretty unprecedented, right? Whether the assessments made of it were positive or negative, I think it was not something that members of the Iranian left, maybe even people within the government ministries expected to be enacted on the scale that it was. So I think before we can even really evaluate the consequences of the white revolution, to me it seems important that, at least for how I'm thinking through these things, we understand what even made it possible so that it could happen. But I totally take your point that, yeah, this is a period of not just sort of financial restructuring, but again, social change. And so that is something I hope to look into more. So thank you for kind of bookmarking that. Yes? Hi.
Do you feel that any stipulations of Yale's past that is intervening with its current means sentences and its future prospects?
Its future prospects? Yeah, I mean, I think what really interested me in this project to begin with is thinking of Khuzestan today, right? I was sort of writing my prospectus in 2020, or at least maybe starting to think about writing my prospectus, when there were a pretty significant round of protests that started going off there regarding electricity outages just as heat was reaching like 120 degrees Fahrenheit, right? And so it was just like, it was really curious and puzzling to me why this should be happening in such a rich province, at least in terms of kind of mineral resources, right? And so I think to maybe answer your question kind of obliquely, I don't know if the past allows us to sort of fully understand Iran's present, at least in terms of how I've thought through it so far, but it does represent a lot of striking parallels. And I think this is maybe useful in terms of, there's such a strong rupture that's posited between Iran before the revolution and after it, right? But I think if we shift our focus a little bit away from the politics of Islam and so on, to think about something like oil and how it has actually kind of underwritten state power, we see that again there's more continuities than we might want to believe. And I think that Iran is still very much kind of in this position of kind of wanting to fight its dependence on oil, but with every kind of step forward in that battle, often entrenching its dependence on it for reasons that I think are again bigger and more complicated than its own making. Yeah, please.
That's good. Yeah. So I sort of engage in the aiming to United Kingdom things like that. Following what you said, I feel like it's not really a prerequisite. It seems like there's been absorption, some meaningful proprietary in the future is obviously really what I'm trying to do. So I guess my question aside from narrative of many things, is how is Iran advocating for things outside of what we have on reserve responsibility? It's not something, it's not the WDF, it's not possible to sue in the time. So if we're relying on what basically fossil fuel source is inconclusive, says 2035. So these are things that are already written, and then to advocate anything outside of that, puts anything that's ancient or anything else that's Iranian, it's like nuts. So I feel like the only means of moving forward setting on is not relying on anything less than whatsoever. And therefore is anything that's united within the purviews of non-monetary practitioners. It's the same thing for what Africa is doing as well as Europe is doing, and Germany is doing the same. So it's just like they're wrong in several things, and that's something. I feel like.
Sorry, we don't have too much. Can you
Yeah.
ask
I feel like your means for outside the election. What it means is that I'm just curious if you're going green, or what's the future prospects of your country?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, what you said, to return to the past before commenting on the future, I've been reading about decolonization and thinking through some of the problems that I try to grapple with here, and the possibility of like a federation is played with and thought through kind of more seriously in the case of Africa than, as far as I know, in like the Middle East, right? You have OPEC, right, which is an attempt to counteract the kind of monopolistic powers of the consortium, and it does allow producer states to insist on terms much more kind of not favorable to them, but on terms that approach something like equitability. But I think. Yeah, I think it's interesting that is happening at the same time that Mohammad Reza Shah and other ministers within Iran are very cognizant of the fact that oil is a finite resource, right? It's like there's this constant tension that I feel like officials are working through, and that I'm still trying to kind of fully wrap my head around. Where on the one hand, like you're saying, there's this appreciation that this commodity is not going to last forever. We have a finite amount of it, and so maybe we need to experiment with nuclear. We need to start exploring our natural gas reserves and so on. But then you have more and more kind of power invested in organizations like OPEC that are not particularly incentivized to wanting to actually like circumvent or overcome dependence on this commodity entirely. So yeah, I mean, I think I don't know what Iran's thinking in terms of green energy for the future is, but I think my hope is by engaging with how these structures of inequality and dependence are kind of erected to begin with, we can begin to understand why it's proven so difficult in Iran and elsewhere to fully kind of overcome them. Thank you. Yes?
Sorry, I didn't get here on time.
That's
so
okay.
I'm not sure if you, but I'm just curious if my question is related to your topics or not. Can you elaborate on how Zahedi, and if you're studying Zahedi's paper, how his views and policies were in whether they were in sync with Shah, Mohammad Reza Shah, or were they different, or how much through, especially through the 50s and 60s, where was he standing versus what Mohammad Reza Shah was?
That's an interesting question. I would say to answer in brief that I don't, and maybe others in the room who have even more familiarity with their papers and respective positions can comment. I haven't noticed a tremendous amount of divergence in terms of the kind of positions and policies that Zahedi forwards and those that the Shah suggests. In fact, I see a lot of agreement, which might help us understand why he has had, Ardeshir Zahedi had such a long career as an ambassador, as an Iranian, or an official to the government. But I think it would be, what I'm hoping to look at next is, or at some point, is the 1973 oil crisis, because Zahedi does, he takes out, for instance, whole pages in the Washington Post to kind of make arguments against the idea that what Iran and other oil-producing states are doing at the time is kind of a form of economic warfare, to suggest that actually this is totally within the right of countries like Iran, and is a form of, again, rectifying what he sees as a sort of long-standing injustice in terms of the oil industry. But that does not immediately strike me, and its sort of brief summarization is again very different from the arguments that the Shah puts forward. I do think that thinking about Zahedi's relationship as kind of an intermediary between the Shah and the U.S., and at times the UK, is interesting. He's viewed very favorably, right, by a lot of other kind of diplomats within the same orbit, right? So whereas Mohammad Reza Shah, I think, increasingly is kind of viewed disdainfully. He's like vain, he's arrogant, he's kind of stubborn and allergic to Western economic reason. Zahedi is sort of a kind of more palatable face and point of, again, interaction between these different governments. So again, I don't think that the positions he advocates are really different, but I think how he does them and the ways that they land are, and maybe crucial to kind of, not totally isolating Iran during this period, even though it kind of does insist more and more on dictating the terms of the West's engagement with its oil industry. Please.
I think Zahedi was actually far more militant than the Shah in facing with the British particularly. He was much more critical of Israel than the Shah was. He was much more in support of establishing relations with the Arab states. And on almost every account, he takes the more radical position. Now, whether he does that in conjunction with the Shah doing the bad cop, good cop, I don't know. But clearly, there is a demarcation. If you read the literature, if you read the documents, that's clearly there. And he's the one who literally threatens England with military attack if British ships enter Iranian waters. And they say they don't know whether this is suggested by the Shah or is Ardeshir being Ardeshir talking rhetorically.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't had a chance to look at kind of communications between these different state agencies when it comes to these different topics. So I was limiting my comment to how they think through different issues related to the oil industry. But yeah, it seems like whatever differences do exist between the two of them should be thought in relationship to one another, right? Since they represent a kind of multi-pronged front in terms of Iran's engagements with the UK, with the US, and other countries. Yes? Thank you.
I saw in your sources you use a lot of printed material like Kahan, and then corporate archives like the Ford Foundation to do research on oil, and then obviously Zahedi papers. What other personal archives are there out there of Iranian officials that you either want to access, wish you could access, or know out there that might be?
Oh, that's a good question, man. There's so many materials already to work through that I haven't really given myself the chance to let my imagination run wild and think what I would access if I could. But I was just thinking today, I mentioned briefly this figure Fuad Rouhani, who is the OPEC General Secretary from 1961 to I'm not really sure when, but he's like the only Iranian to have ever held this position. And I think his papers would be really interesting to access and compare, kind of as we've already been trying to do a little bit here with some of the other arguments different people within the Pahlavi government are making about kind of economic warfare, imperialism, oil, and so on. So yeah, that's one figure that comes immediately to mind. But yes, this is definitely a project that relies a lot on textual sources. So you guys don't know how hard it was to try to come together with like a few visual sources to put in these PowerPoint slides. Yes?
I feel like the main person you're talking about here, so I've done my study with I've not for Stanford or SEC, from Scotland. So outside of the distant of the future West or East purview or ideal for West, do you feel that there's anything you topic because I feel like perhaps my Iranian friends tell me that people won't drive because or want oil there because they don't want the same thing as the West. So it wouldn't, still be a timeline or like a timeline in that sense. Because I'm chewing on the same things. I have theses that are consolidated at formula and outside of Cambridge and other places. So and they make heads and tails of it in this country. So I'm just curious about not much of the historian.
Right.
Or the means of it is fascinating. And I think that it is worth the conversation and not censorship. To not adopt narratives in that sense. So I'm just curious what momentum is there. I've never been there. So just kind of like halfway around it. So I just kind of looked for insight because I ended up coming back to the 15 years and I wanted to be here because of its proprietary.
Right.
California side. So I think that a lot of people come here for the education, higher education of pharmaceutical education.
Sorry, again, is there a question?
Yeah, I'll leave it. But this is for her prospects. That's what we're getting. So the means of it is that I'm just curious what your young mind is, like where you arrive for the said view.
Yeah. So, I mean, I understand your question to basically be like, what is the relationship between sort of universalist and versus particularist aspirations, right? And I think one of the points I tried to emphasize in this presentation, but that I think I'll try to elaborate on elsewhere in the dissertation, is the struggles that ensue from trying to adopt and follow this universal model of development that obviously derives from the West's experience with the transition from, like rural society to industrial modernity. I think for the most part, I would say actually there is, as I tried to show in the transition from the second development plan to the third, there is an effort to question the feasibility of adopting wholesale, like a universal model of development, right? Especially one that prioritizes really grand projects like hydroelectric dams over, small scale, low cost reforms in agriculture, because there is already so much existing infrastructure that really just needs to be revitalized, for instance, in the form of these irrigation canals, right? So the failures or shortcomings of the second plan do cause both American development advisors and Iranian officials to reconsider the merits of, again, this universal model. But I think, in a lot of ways, the overarching trajectory of these decades, right, from the 50s to the late 70s and culminating in the revolution, could be seen as kind of a struggle between these two competing visions, right? One of a kind of universalist model of economic growth and progress that I think the Mohammad Reza Shah really kind of continues to insist on, and then different factions within Iran who really feel like there needs to be a push for and an embrace of kind of particularism, cultural, economic, and so on. Although I think, a lot of scholars have even recently made the qualification or revision that the Pahlavi government pursues this dual model of development, where on the one hand, in essence, a lot of the stages are kind of conform to this Rostovian model of modernization, but the cultural kind of facade that overlays it should be distinctly Iranian, right? So yeah, that's how I see a lot of the characteristics of these decades playing out, and I don't know that they've been fully resolved, but thank you. Yeah.
How you related the element? Go back to the second or third slide.
This one?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is a kind of graph just illustrating the different stages that the scholar W.W. Rustow, who becomes kind of like the proponent of modernization, the kind of primary articulation of modernization theory, lays out. And Iran is thought to have barely even it's still very much a traditional society is the thinking. It has, and so the development plans are really meant to lay the preconditions for takeoff. And after achieving those, it's thought that Iran will, quote, take off and then achieve industrialization, very much the model of the West. So yeah, that comes under a lot of scrutiny after the early 50s, but it's not enough for officials to abandon it entirely yet either. Yes.
If I understood you correctly, I think you implied that white revolution is really a cosmetic revolution, and I think I agree with that. Maybe you can say if I agree with that. Well, actually, that's my point of view. I think that was a reaction from Shah to materialism dialectic of Karl Marx, that we can make a transition to a capitalist society without any conflict.
Right.
So I think you said that it was a cosmetic revolution, but I tend to agree with that. It didn't do anything. From my knowledge, I'm not an Iranian expert by any means, but I don't think it did anything.
I mean, as one of our audience members commented earlier, I do think that there were some significant social transformations that issued from the White Revolution. I'm limiting my attention pretty narrowly to thinking about land reform and agriculture. And I think scholars have generally made the argument, which I would second, to say that although the White Revolution is really introduced and announced as this revolutionary program of land redistribution, that stage of the White Revolution is actually really quickly pivoted away from in favor of investing in large-scale, capital-intensive agriculture, right? That is not actually going to do much to improve the conditions of Iran's peasantry, right? So that's not to say, though, that it is cosmetic. I think it is to say that the kind of aura that the Shah wants to impart to the revolution has rightly maybe been questioned. I think I don't think that is my preferred mode of kind of engaging with or criticizing the White Revolution. I think Iranian historiography is really like too dominated by this kind of thinking, like, you know, what are the personal politics happening here, and, you know, how sincere or not is this person in their motivation for whatever. I'm really trying to kind of connect what seems to be treated as like different areas of action and reform together to kind of think of how we might arrive at a more integrated view of these changes. And so what I've attempted to do today here is suggest that I don't think we can talk about the White Revolution independently of transformations that are, for instance, happening in the plan organization and in people's thinking about development writ large. So yeah, I appreciate why some people think of it as a cosmetic revolution, but I think there's definitely more to the story than that.
Well, I remember the last days of the Shah, there was poverty in Iran,
Mm-hmm.
and there was also, people were not literate, even though they had something that people were going and teaching people, but it was pretty bad. I remember the last days of the Shah.
No, I don't.
Personally, so that's
Yeah.
why I think that because the White Revolution was really a cosmetic revolution that didn't do anything.
Mm-hmm. I don't doubt that there was still a tremendous amount to be done, and I think it was interesting to me, like reviewing a lot of these correspondences and negotiations that happen over the IMF stabilization package. Consistently, what you see suggested every time that a sort of government expenditure is cut is that we should cut this from social services. And so that would lend credence to what you're saying, right? Which is like, if this revolution purports to kind of want to rework the fabric of Iranian society altogether, why is it that, you know, illiteracy, poverty, and so on remain to be such overwhelming problems by the time the revolution happened? And I think that's not unrelated to the fact that, you know, despite an avowed interest in social reform, it's very frequently cut with the support of the U.S. and non-governmental institutions like the IMF from any kind of national development plans.
I cannot understand how we are expecting from people who are after 45 years still kissing hand of the mullahs that suddenly Shah would make a Switzerland from Iran. I mean, we should see from where we start and which kind of development we do. Just criticizing that it was poverty. Yes, of course that is poverty. But what is the improvement?
Mm-hmm.
I think that is necessarily okay. We cannot just expect Switzerland from there.
Right.
Even now that people buying and kissing hand of the mullahs.
I think there's
Switzerland and
right.
everyone equal. Or?
I think there's a few ways of assessing the consequences and impact of the White Revolution, and one of those is by comparing Iran, as you're suggesting, to other countries who have, you know, already achieved industrial modernity, however we define it, and another is by comparing the aftermath of the White Revolution to the rhetoric that surrounds it. And I think it's maybe in those terms that people see, even within Iran, certain shortcomings, right? Is according even to the logic of the Shah, the White Revolution does not quite deliver the promises that you know, were suggested.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.